All right, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Sieloff. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and we are so pleased to have you with us today for today's webinar, When Life Hands You a Landfill. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you all or encourage you all to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can also visit our website at www.cclear.org to sign up for our newsletter, which comes out quarterly and is full of all kinds of good and useful information. A little bit of background about the Center for Creative Land Recycling for those who may not be familiar with us. We are an EPA Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities grantee, and through the TAB program, as we call it, we provide technical assistance to communities, tribes, neighborhoods, a variety of stakeholders. We do that via workshops and webinars like this one. We also provide policy and research. We're active as consultants. And of course, you can always visit our website or simply just give us a call with your questions. You can see down at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide that we have phone numbers and emails for several of the staff at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. With that, I'd like to open up a couple of polling questions to give our speakers today an idea of who is on the line. First, what sector do you work in? And the results are coming in. And we'll give it a few more seconds, but it looks like about half or a little over are with state and local government. We have about 10% each with the federal government and nonprofits, and 25% with or 23% with the private sector. Thank you very much. Next question. How many years have you been involved in the land reuse field? Again, we'll wait for these results to come in, but it looks like we've got a pretty good spread. I'm seeing about 40% of you, roughly, with 0 to 5 years of experience, 25% with 5 to 10, 15% with 10 to 15 years, and 20% of you with more than 20 years of experience. Fantastic. So this is a diverse crowd. Finally, looking at this map of EPA regions, you can see here that we've got the entire country laid out. SCClear is a TAB provider to regions 2, 9, and 10, and we'd like to know, where are you? So what EPA TAB region do you work in? And we've organized it here by TAB provider. All right, and these numbers will continue to shift, but it looks like roughly about 70% of you are coming from SCClear's regions. We've got about 18% from Kansas State University's regions, and 9% from NJIT's regions. So great, welcome everyone. This is fantastic. Next slide. All right, so on to the stars of the show. I'm so happy to share with you an outline of today's presentation, and then I'll introduce our speakers. We're going to hand things over shortly to Mike McLaughlin and Joe Miller from SCS Engineers, and we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So please keep in mind that if you have a question, you can record it, you can write it down throughout the webinar and send it to us. All right. I am not going to read biographies, but I would like to introduce to you Mike McLaughlin, Senior Vice President for Environmental Services at SCS Engineers based in Reston, Virginia, and Joe Miller, who's here with us in the office, Vice President for Solid Waste Management Services at SCS based out of Pleasanton, California. Joe and Mike, I'd like to hand it over to you so that you can say a few words to introduce yourselves and take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. Joe, did you want to start and introduce yourself, and then I'll take it for the next couple of minutes?
Very good. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. This is Joe Miller with SCS Engineers. I work in our Northern California office in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a registered engineer in California and have been the lead technical designer, permitter for all types of solid waste projects, including landfills, organics processing facility, recycling facilities, and in the last several years have been involved with several dozen repurposing of old landfill sites into something higher and better use. Mike?
Thanks, Joe. My name is Mike McLaughlin. I'm a licensed engineer and an attorney who celebrated my 44th anniversary last Wednesday. So I'm 44 years and 1 week employed by SCS Engineers. An old girlfriend got me this job, and somehow I've kept it those years. I get the pleasure of talking about one of my very favorite subjects this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. And it's actually the poster child, really, for the Center for Creative Land Recycling. There's nothing more creative than recycling an old landfill. And I'm just very excited to have anybody listen to me on this subject. My wife is kind of tired of it. Let's move ahead. What I had in mind for an outline for today's presentation was basically how we get new life into old dumps. We want to talk a little bit about the challenges, and those include understanding what drives this market. I want to talk a few minutes about legal issues. Then Joe is going to talk us through technical issues and costs. Joe will talk about one case study in the western U.S., and I'll talk about one case study in the eastern U.S. And then we'll have a couple of thoughts to take home, we hope. Call them keys to success or lessons learned, sometimes the hard way. But that's what we had in mind covering today. If you have a topic in mind that we don't cover, we'll be happy to try to address that during the questions and answers at the end. You know, the conventional wisdom is that you can't really do anything with an old landfill. It's stuck that way forever. Or if you're really adventurous, the old way of thinking was we could put a park on it or some kind of open recreation space, some kind of low-intensity land use. And that's been the conventional wisdom for quite a while. But as we have seen, these sites really can be used for just about anything you can imagine. They can be used safely for just about any kind of land use you can imagine. And we've got commercial office business parks that we put on these things, a lot of shopping centers and retail space on old closed landfills, obviously industrial warehouses. They make an excellent place, or they can make an excellent place for solar farms, for collecting alternative energy from the sun. Overflow parking, if you will, for either vehicles or new vehicles or containers that are coming from overseas. We've got mixed-use multifamily development type complexes on these things, a lot of commercial and entertainment kinds of land uses, and I've got at least one single-family residential complex built on top of a landfill that seems to be working just fine. Thank you very much. So what we want to share with you today is a little bit of what kind of drives this market and what's possible. And as I say, if you've got a little creativity and an idea, chances are good that we could figure out some way to put that on an old landfill approached properly. I want to talk for a few minutes about some of the legal and regulatory issues, and let me just pause right here. What puts off many developers, people thinking about redeveloping a brownfield site, as I'm sure most of the people on this call are aware, are the liability concerns that arise under the federal Superfund law and similar kinds of liability that arise under different state laws. And anytime you mention that you're thinking about putting fill in the blank kind of a development on top of an old landfill, the local permitting agencies prick up their ears a little bit. They're very interested to know how you're going to do this safely. And you do get a little more scrutiny on these kind of redevelopment projects than many others that we're associated with. And there's a linkage here, as I'm going to be talking about in just a moment. The main way that you can assuage the liability concerns under Superfund is to deal with some of the technical issues that Joe will be talking about, making sure the building, whatever the land use is, stands up structurally, doesn't settle out of sight, protect those structures from methane accumulations that can be very dangerous, protect water quality, both surface water and groundwater quality, and protect the people that are going to be doing the construction anyway that might come in contact with some of that old waste. And again, Joe will be talking about some of those issues here in just a few minutes. So let me talk about Superfund for the next several. And Superfund, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, enacted in 1980 as President Reagan came into office, establishes what most view as a strict liability statute that provides joint and several liability for a long list of response costs that could be incurred. And one of the categories of liable parties for the first 22 years of the statute's existence were landowners. If you own the property, you bought essentially unlimited liability. And that, of course, puts off many developers. They're not used to giving all their money to somebody else. And so that can be a real crimp in your style when you're trying to redevelop any kind of an old site. But in 2002, Congress passed a new law, and President Bush signed it into law that provided a new defense called the bona fide prospective purchaser defense. And again, many of you on the call are probably thoroughly familiar with this, so I don't plan to belabor it. But the point is, if you do certain things, you can avoid this unmitigated, unlimited liability, even if you do own the land. And this has really been quite a help for landfill redevelopment. And you see the first four conditions that have to be satisfied listed on this slide. The disposal of hazardous substances had to happen before you acquired the facility. You had to have undertaken all appropriate inquiries into previous ownership and uses. And by the way, most cases, I think, a landfill will qualify as a recognized environmental condition under the appropriate, all appropriate inquiries rule. To the extent that there are discovery of releases that you make in connection with buying the property, you need to make any legally required notifications. And you've got to provide cooperation, assistance, and access to government agencies that want to come in and look at what you may have discovered. So those are the first four conditions, and they apply to all folks that want to avail themselves of BFPP protection. In case of landfills, some of the institutional controls that could be in place with respect to the landfill can be pretty important. There are, in some instances, deed notifications that may already be on file to the extent that there is a landfill and you can't disturb it except in accordance with this or that provision. And you need to comply with those institutional controls to maintain your BFPP status. And the second bullet on this page has to do with crossing corporate veils. No shenanigans. This is really a situation where somebody who had nothing to do with the landfill wants to come in and buy it, and that's what that that condition of the BFPP is all about. And then the ones that matter the most, I will say, is this last characteristic that you have to comply with. You have to take appropriate care. You have to take the necessary, reasonable steps to stop continuing releases, prevent future releases, and prevent or limit exposures to the stuff that's in that landfill. And let me talk a little bit about what that doesn't include. EPA has said, anyway, that they don't regard that as requiring the new landowner to take extraordinary steps, to spend millions of dollars trying to remediate groundwater that they didn't cause the contamination, or trying to excavate, for example, an entire landfill and move it somewhere else. At least the way that EPA's guidance is written up, we're not expecting super heroic efforts to do these three little bullets here: stop, prevent, and prevent. But it probably does include at least taking steps to protect people from decomposition gas that gets formed in a landfill. The methane gas in that gas can hurt people. So you probably got to take steps to mitigate those conditions, and you probably do have to maintain the integrity of the cap or improve it. I mean, I will say that my experience has been that a building on top of a landfill is a pretty good cap. People tend to maintain the roofs and so forth on their buildings, and so those are probably among the things you'd have to do to exercise appropriate care. There is depending on where you are, obviously, there are specific regulatory requirements that you may have to comply with over and above what I've just described as Superfund considerations. There are some states that require even old unpermitted landfills to be blessed, if you will, by a state agency for a change in their post-closure use. So if the post-closure use is going from nothing to a shopping center, some states want to sign off on that process under their solid waste regulations. And there are some states, I mean, Texas comes to mind with their subchapter T rules, that have a statewide requirement for what has to be done with respect to old landfills that you happen to come across, again, whether or not they were permitted. But many states, I'll say most states, don't really regulate the post-closure uses of older pre-Subtitle D landfills ones that closed, 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. Most states don't regulate that as a matter of statewide kind of regulations, even if they had one of those old one-page permits that some states issued back in those days. So these really are not so much landfill regulations for the most part in many states. Well, what kind of rules do apply? Well, there are voluntary cleanup programs that really make it a lot easier to redevelop an old landfill. And again, most of the folks on this phone call, I'm sure, are familiar with these programs in their jurisdictions. You can, depending on the program, you can get a formal seal of approval for the mitigation measures that you've taken at the landfill site. That can be very useful when it comes time to market the project, to have the state having looked over your shoulder and concur that what you did was the appropriate and right things to do. That seal of approval can be very helpful. Another thing that you can get in many states is the ability to relocate excavated wastes somewhere else on the site. EPA has had a so-called area of contamination policy that they've followed for many years, and some states follow it, without needing to get the state involved at all. But other states say that if you want to relocate solid waste on a site, you've got to have some kind of a state permit or state permission to do that, and a lot of the voluntary cleanup programs have that ability. Here in Virginia, we have something we call remediation waste management units, and if you're in our voluntary remediation program here in Virginia, you can obtain the ability to do a remediation waste management unit and save quite a lot of money and a lot of space in a landfill that charges you $50, $60, $70 a ton. You can save all of that. And of course, the legal protections that you get under those state programs vary state by state. So what drives the need? Why would anybody in their right mind consider redeveloping a landfill? Well, in the middle of this slide, the three things that always matter when it comes to real estate is location, location, and location. And when the market is going well, when the real estate industry in a jurisdiction is going well, it turns out there aren't all that many great sites for a lot of the land uses that people have in mind, where there's a demand for retail or a demand for commercial office space. Sometimes the very best site around is that old landfill that is sitting in the middle of an area that used to be out all by itself in the country, and now it's got good roads and good infrastructure around it. So again, landfills often are near major highways, good access. That's one of the things you have to have for a landfill, is to be able to get heavy trucks in there carrying trash. And again, the proximity to those kinds of network nodes and so forth can really provide quite a leg up when it comes to the value of the last piece of undeveloped land in the market, for example. Not every developer has the appetite to take on one of these sorts of projects. There is a little more involved in redeveloping a landfill than there is a greenfield. There's even more involved in redeveloping a landfill than there is in redeveloping many brownfield sites. But there are a number of developers around the country that have had multiple landfill redevelopment projects under their belt, and it's getting easier all the time to satisfy developers' concerns over the risks associated with these kind of projects. So I'm going to close with this bumper sticker. I think landfill redevelopment can be smart growth. I really do think this is one of the smartest things that we can do in our industry. I've talked about this already. Closed landfills often are real close to good transportation. There's already utility infrastructure there. Sometimes they got the best view in the area. If you visit Mount Trashmore in Virginia Beach, you can see for miles up there. That's on top of the old landfill at the city of Virginia Beach. Some old landfills happen to be right next to waterfront. A lot of these are just very attractive sites, I will say. I mentioned this earlier. Urban and suburban sprawl, if you will, have overtaken, in many jurisdictions, they've kind of overtaken old landfills that used to be out in the country all by themselves. And And I'll close with the notion that redevelopment can improve the stewardship, the care of these old sites. If you imagine a cap that gets inspected, a landfill cap that gets inspected once every 3 or 4 months, well, that's not very often, is it? That's all that many states require for post-closure of undeveloped landfills. But a landfill that's been redeveloped for a shopping center has got housewives and house husbands out there buying groceries, and if there's a hole that develops in the parking lot, the landlord hears about it, and it gets fixed pretty quickly. So active management of an old closed landfill, I think, can really improve post-closure care. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joe Miller, to talk to us about some of these technical issues.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. And that was a great presentation on the regulatory and legal framework as to what administrative measures are needed. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the technical issues that are to be considered as part of any landfill development. And basically, there's 2 things at play. Number one, and this is what makes landfills different than, as you said, a greenfield or a brownfield site. Number one is the ground moves, so you have to account for that. Number 2 is what's in the landfill generates landfill gas, which is primarily methane, which can create a safety hazard. As Mike, as you mentioned, there are also some other issues about constructing on landfill sites, mainly maintaining the infrastructure that's there for environmental protection, whether it be the cap that was placed, a clay cap, or the cover and drainage systems, or any kind of liquids collection system. They have to be, if not enhanced, sometimes replaced. And that's what you called, Mike, the appropriate steps. All right, so let's move on, and we'll take some examples. We can't talk about all these things today, but just a few. Well, what happens when you put garbage in a landfill and cover it with dirt? It undergoes a few processes. One of them is decomposition. So any organic material is going to go through biodegradation and convert from solid carbon into gaseous methane. All right, and that's one thing. And so, I'm sorry, let's go back one slide. And so what happens then? The landfill can sink. There are also some issues that with consolidation of the weight of the landfill itself and or liquids infiltration. So what can it do? It can create settlement. And here we have an example of what's called soft edge settlement. And that is where you find the edge of a landfill butts up against the native soil in the surrounding area. And here, that can create some problems with drainage, ponding water, or in the case of a playing field, what athletes like to call an uneven playing surface. So you have to consider some things to fix that as part of any kind of redevelopment. On to the next slide. Here we have an example of settlement that we call hard edge settlement. And here we have a building that was constructed on top of a fill. I think the landfill is 30, 40 feet deep. It's on pile-supported foundation. And we see examples of the ground around settling while the building stays still. So that can create a lot of problems, not only for getting in and out of the building and curb and gutter and traffic circulation, but also for utilities that can break, or ruptured water lines, or ruptured sewer lines, and all kinds of bad stuff. So these challenges can be overcome with good engineering, good construction, and dedicated post-closure care. So we'll move on to the next. So back to settlement. What do we do to take care of that? And the first thing is on site preparation, making the ground ready for development. And one option is to excavate and replace the waste with good, clean structural soil or fill. That can be expensive, particularly if you're looking at a landfill site that has many hundreds of thousands of tons of wastes. It's generally cost prohibitive. So there are some other methods that can be done to prepare the site. And if we move to the next slide, one of them is called preloading or surcharging. Here we have an example of a site in Southern California, an old landfill. It was originally a quarry, then it was filled with trash, and now it's going to be a parking lot for adjacent commercial businesses. And it's got some low spots and some voids. So this is called surcharging. It's a pretty proven simple method. You put clean soil fill on top of the landfill, and you let it wait. And what it does, it accelerates that settlement over time. It requires a little bit of time and a source of cheap fill, but it allows you to measure that settlement over time, and that may be possible when you have phased construction. In other words, you're digging up dirt from one part of the site and you need to put it somewhere else. Let's put it on here and we'll do some surcharge fill. Another method is called dynamic compaction, again, to accelerate this settlement. And this is what we call the brute force approach. In essence, take a big heavy object and drop it from height and compact the landfill artificially, if you will. This is limited to sites that have garbage and waste underneath 20, 30 feet, so it doesn't apply to deep fill sites, and it only works on level surfaces, not necessarily on slopes. But this, after my dream job would be the wrecking ball operator, that would be the second one. It would be the operator of that crane to do dynamic compaction. So that's about site development. What about buildings? So there are a number of mitigation measures that can be employed to make buildings structurally safe. And they are deep pile foundations, that is driving, in essence, stilts into the ground to hold up the building slab. They can be steel, they can be precast concrete, they can even be tube steel. And that's one method. There's also another method called drill displacement columns. That's coming into vogue now. It has different names in different parts of the country. But in essence, the foundation, you drill down and you backfill with grout as you go. Sometimes you can place the reinforcing steel in that grout mix before you take the before you move on. Then you put engineered soil mat on top of that, and then you pour your traditional slab on grade foundation on top of that. Some have called that akin to sleeping on a bed of nails, and it has it's been favored by regulatory agencies because it protects the groundwater in providing a grout seal where the pile penetrations would go into the water table. There are also some other methods. I'm sorry, we'll go back one right here. But which is best? Every time geotechnical and structural considerations govern. I always defer to the structural engineer. What will hold the building up? And there are things that you need to consider to prevent contaminant migration and minimizing waste spoils that can be expensive to haul and get rid of. But you want to balance all of those with overall cost. Next slide, please. Here we have an example of a pile foundation system. Now, Mike asked earlier, who in the world would want to build something on top of a landfill? Well, here we have a prominent home improvement center that is built on top of a 100-foot deep landfill. Why? Because there's opportunity. This happens to be in an urban area that is severely underserved by construction materials and supplies. And if we could move to the, by the way, that retailer, that one facility near San Francisco happens to be the company's highest grossing facility in the country per square foot. And it's on an old landfill. How about that? Mm-hmm. Anyway, here we see an example of how did you keep that building on 100 feet of trash? How did you keep it to stand up? And this is pretty interesting. On the right, you see the pile foundation that is tied to the structural slab. And something really interesting here that was done by the engineer. As we saw in an earlier slide, the ground can sink away from the hard edge. Well, this designer came up with a hinged slab. Imagine, if you will, a series of what look like piano keys are the apron to the building. Only these piano keys are 20 by 80 feet, solid concrete, fixed on one side, so that as the land settles, you can come in later and jack up one side and create it so that you don't have shopping carts rolling downhill, et cetera, et cetera. So that's some things for dealing with settlements at landfill. The other big issue is methane gas protection. And again, we mentioned earlier that decomposition creates landfill gas, which under certain conditions can be, if it could infiltrate into a building through a slab crack or a utility penetration, get into an enclosed space and there's a spark, it could cause an explosion. That's very, very rare in the industry, but it can happen. And with good engineering, we can mitigate against that. And there are a number of mitigation systems that are employed. I'm guessing that many here in the audience are familiar with vapor intrusion. Well, they're the same kinds of things. Frankly, the vapor intrusion business stole from us landfill engineers with these methods, and they include active gas extraction to pull it out of the ground, put it in pipes, and then send it into a flare and burn it, send it through a carbon filter. We have membrane barriers and venting systems and other utility collars that also work. Move to the next slide. Here we see an example of a sub-slab vapor barrier. In essence, it's a sandwich that is underneath a structural slab. And you see the various layers here running from the compacted subgrade or soil onto the slab. And this is a spray-on product that's pretty cool. Why am I showing this one? It's because for landfills, as we saw earlier, the ground underneath can sink if your building's on pile foundation. So you need a way to keep that membrane from adhering to the bottom of the slab, or it won't work. So what this product does is it has a bonding agent that sticks to the concrete. In essence, it's like the top of a kitchen sponge. So when you lay your membrane down and you have this kitchen sponge on top of that, the concrete adheres to that and it sticks to the bottom of the slab later. Very cool product. Part of a methane mitigation system is not only an impermeable membrane, but a venting system. And here we show an example of a subgrade pipe below the building slab. And this one happens to be flexible pipe because, again, we may see settlement, so that pipe has to bend. It has holes in the pipe to collect the gas, and then it whisks it up the side of the building into a spinner vent. And here we see some examples of those systems under construction. A gravel bed that has, before the membrane is sprayed on, and then before the slab is poured, and you see some of the pipes traversing what will be a grade beam for a foundation. On the right, you see what we have is a vent riser where the gas is collected and it goes to a spinner vent and ventilates harmlessly to atmosphere. Here we see an example of a different kind of a methane mitigation system. Again, a vapor barrier. This one happens to be high-density polyethylene. In essence, this is a Glad bag on steroids. It's about halfway thick between a trash bag and a Frisbee. Very stout material. It has to be seamed together, and it provides a very effective membrane barrier to gas intrusion. All right, so Mike asked earlier, who would want to do this? Well, an important consideration is what does it cost? And in our experience, these special foundations to mitigate settlement can be anywhere from 2 to 4.5 times the cost of a traditional slab-on-grade spread footing. And those costs depend on where you're located, your underlying geology, and a lot of different factors. An example from a recent project here in the Bay Area looks at those costs, a spread. The conventional slab-on-grade is about $17 a square foot footprint area, whereas a deep pile foundation in our case would have been about $78. And then that earlier configuration I explained, the drill displacement column where you grout as you drill, a little bit more cost effective. That's the bed of nails that I explained earlier. So it can vary, and again, depends on your geotechnical and structural engineers. The methane mitigation systems can range anywhere from $4 to $12 a square foot. Again, including an alarm system in the building would be on the high end. All told, we've been told by contractors that the environmental costs, the incremental environmental costs for building on a landfill can be 25% higher than on a greenfield site. So with that, we'll pause for a second with a poll question. And our poll question is, after all you've heard, is there anybody in their right mind that would want to do this kind of thing? And the question is, I would want to touch a landfill development with a ruler, a yardstick, a 10-foot pole. I wouldn't touch it at all. Or I'm that kind of person. I like challenges. I could do it. So let's open the poll. Well, the results are in. We have a confident group. Over 40% say, I'm in. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. That's good to hear. All right. Well, let's move to the next slide, and we'll see a case study. and Mike's going to show one too. This is we have one from the West Coast and one from the previous, I'm sorry, one prior. There we go. There's a nice aerial shot of a former landfill that was developed as an office park in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is in the center of the Silicon Valley. Next slide, please. So, 45-acre landfill, filled in the 1940s through the 70s. Well, the development entailed 20 buildings, nearly 1 million square feet of office space for the tech sector. And many tenants there you'd recognize. Their social media, their communications, their photo share sites, their famous companies. This particular project, an old landfill, has been income producing for nearly 18 years. And there's some pretty cool things that were done to make this project possible. Many of the things we talked about, pile foundation. In this case, there were over 2,200 piles were driven through 43 feet of trash and into the underlying geologic unit. In our case, it's the Bay Muds of San Francisco Bay. There are also some floating utility connections, flex pipes, utility vaults that could be moved and jacked so that repairs were made easy, and a methane mitigation system that was very robust, very similar to what I described before. One thing I will mention that made this project very unique, what are called utility raceways. You might recall an earlier slide that had the picture of the ground settling away, and how could you possibly put utilities under a building? Well, you don't want to do that at a landfill. So they built, integral to the slab, trenches. Imagine 3 foot wide, 3 foot deep, with the top of the trench being equal to the floor of the building. The developer knew that there'd be high-tech tenants coming that wanted to do lab work, research, and they would need communication. So that allowed them the flexibility to bring in new tenants and have their utilities be safe from the effects of settlement. So that's been a very successful project in the Bay Area. So with that, I'm going to conclude and hand the baton back to my colleague for a case study on the East Coast, and then we'll wrap and have time for some questions. Mike?
Thanks, Joe. On your screen, if you're seeing what I'm seeing, it's the Belvoir Business Center in Newington, Virginia. Anybody who's familiar with Northern Virginia may be familiar with Fort Belvoir. It's one of the lucky installations that survived the most recent round of so-called BRAC, Base Realignment and Closure. You can see in the lower right-hand corner of that Google Map view the airport runway for the Fort Belvoir Davison Airfield, if that helps you get oriented for those that know Northern Virginia. But it's a pretty cool project. Let's step along here to the next slide. When I was growing up, this was an old quarry, a sand quarry. It was used for constructing the nearby Interstate 95, the Shirley Highway that leads into Washington, D.C. And when it was done being a quarry, it had to be filled in with something. They got a permit and put in a landfill there. And it basically got backfilled over the course of 7 years. It was mostly a construction and demolition debris landfill, but about 25% of it was filled with non-C&D materials, paper and that kind of thing. And so that's a little bit of a sense of what that landfill was like. It's about 60 feet deep at the deepest parts, and it was it covered 60 acres, and it happened to have a Washington Gas light easement right across the middle of it, so we had 30 acres on the eastern mound and 30 acres on the western mound. I mentioned that Fort Belvoir was a winner in BRAC. Well, they won 20,000 jobs, and the developers in the neighborhood were wondering where we're going to find office space and commercial support space for all of those workers that would be attracted to Fort Belvoir, particularly in the case of things like defense contractors that would want office space and that kind of thing. So the eastern mound got redeveloped as a FedEx ground facility. FedEx is always looking for better places with better transportation, and they thought this site was ideally located. And it's got a great big FedEx ground facility on the eastern mound. And then 20,000 square feet of office space are going to be built on the western mound. That's the plan. A couple of things that I would like to mention before I wrap up this thing. This site was put into the Virginia Voluntary Remediation Program, and it took some doing to do that because the state was not wild about having an old landfill in its VRP program. Today, I think they hold this out as one of the better examples of how that program has worked to accomplish good things, to take old brownfields areas and turn them into productive land uses. The FedEx building has got a pile foundation system, 60-foot, 65-foot piles that friction bearing at the end of them. It has an active methane mitigation system. One of the ones that Joe described would be picture a blower on the roof or a series of blowers on the roof that constantly evacuate the area underneath the floor slab to keep methane gas from being able to accumulate under the floor slab, let alone get through the floor slab into the building. And then I think this is kind of neat. There is a concern. You can see some nearby structures in one of these buildings, or one of these photos at the bottom of the slide. There's some nearby structures that need to be protected from any migrating methane gas, but it didn't need very much in the way of power. So we have some solar-powered blowers installed along one property line to basically take care of controlling that methane gas, the decomposition gases that might otherwise be inclined to leave the site. But it's a pretty cool project. It's been operational since 2010, and has done everything that we hoped it would to this point. And again, the state holds it out as a model. So, what are some of those takeaway points that we wanted to leave you with? Some of those keys to success. My bumper sticker is, I think landfill redevelopment can indeed be smart growth. It can be ideally suited to almost any land use, and it can take advantage of existing infrastructure. It does require an owner who's willing to do the right thing. This is not simple stuff. It's not all that complicated either, though. I mean, if you met Joe or I, you'd know it's not that complicated. But they do have to want to do it right. It's important to do it right, to take care, to study it properly and to design carefully, and then to make sure that what is promised in the way of design gets constructed. If you've got sound engineering and a good contractor and have an attention to maintaining these systems, you will overcome these challenges and have a successful project. And I talked about active management of an old closed landfill. Developing a site or having a revenue producing site with retail businesses paying rent, that provides a revenue source that can be used to make sure that the site stays safe and is maintained properly. And I think these are some of the keys to success. With that, I'm going to stop talking and wait for questions from the audience.
All right, this is Joe, and we have some questions coming over the e-waves. One individual asked, do you have any best practices for dealing with tires in landfills? In our case, they're rising to the surface and poking through the cap. All right, that is a great question, and that is a challenge we find at active landfills, where the cream rises to the top, as they say. Most landfills, at least in California, now have BMPs in place for operating, where the tires are shredded, or they're taken to separate facilities, or they're put in separate cells. Now, I don't know if the listener is talking about redeveloping this site, but unfortunately they probably have to be excavated out and stockpiled and taken away as part of any site improvement, if that's being contemplated. Mike, do you have anything to add on that one?
Well, we shredded some of those tires up and used them for landscaping at some sites, but you're right, Joe, these things rise. I guess there's also the potential to install some kind of a plastic mat, grid matting that could help keep those things from wanting to rise. But it's more likely you have to excavate them and shred them up.
Okay. A second question, and I think this would be directed to Mike on the legal and regulatory, is a BFPP recommended when selling a property?
Well, the BFPP, of course, is for the prospective purchaser. So prospective purchasers are the ones that want to make sure that they check all those boxes and actually do more than check the boxes, actually accomplish those things that I went over. But I don't know of any reason why you wouldn't want to qualify as a BFPP if you're at all able to do so. So yeah, I think that's recommended. I'll call that best practices these days.
And I'll add that in California, state law requires that when a landfill property changes hands, that the seller must notify the buyer and notify all of the state agencies that a new owner is purchasing the site. Okay, we have another question, and maybe you could help me expand that one question. Is there an example of piles penetrating? Oh, okay. All right, the question is there an example of piles penetrating the landfill that has been accepted? And the answer is yes. I showed an example of a facility in the Bay Area. Those were friction piles that were driven through the fill, 2,200 of them, and they were into the underlying geology, and that was accepted. We have a project here, not SCS, but one of our competitors is doing a multi-use development near the new football stadium for the 49ers. It's going to include hotels and retails and office space. And the piles there have very careful consideration. They're what's called grouting, as the piles penetrate through the waste, the idea being that you don't want to create a conduit for any leachate or contaminated water to go into the groundwater table.
If I could, Joe, I've had this conversation with some regulatory agencies, and when you have an old clay liner, essentially compacted clay underneath the landfill, which is the liner that was at the FedEx facility, the Belvoir Business Center that I was talking about. Actually, if you drive a pile through that, imagine what happens to the clay. It doesn't pull back. It actually it's even tighter. It's more compact around the H pile where it goes through. The pile displaces the clay, but the clay wants to push back against it. If anything, you've probably improved the ability to resist leachate being able to move down along that piling. And there's some science to that. There's some literature and studies to that effect. And several states have, after they think about it, have gotten comfortable with the idea that pilings don't necessarily ruin the landfill liner. Most of the leachate's long since gone at this point anyway.
All right, thank you, Mike. We have another question. How do you deal with redeveloping a landfill that has been closed under the, air quotes, old standards? And that's an excellent question, and there are several examples of that. We have found that whenever, when you call the old standards, that would be, in California we call pre-regulations. That's basically where the owner just put some uncontrolled soil on top of the waste, wiped his or her hands and walked away. That's the old standards. What we found is that when you want to move to do something new and interesting and repurpose the landfill, you invite the attention of the regulatory agencies, and often they peer their nose under the tent more than they would if the site were left fallow or unattended to. And in fact, there is a requirement to upgrade the cap to meet current regulatory standards. That could be reinstalling clay, or as Mike mentioned earlier, sometimes the buildings themselves would serve as the cap. Sometimes the asphalt parking surface, if properly graded and drained, can serve as an alternate cap. But in many cases, some form of cap and or drainage system is required to bring it up to what is close to modern closure standards. That was a good question.
Okay, great. So fantastic questions from the audience. We have a little more time, and so I'm going to, I'd like to ask a couple of questions myself here. Joe, before we got started, you mentioned that there are 3 C's to landfill redevelopment, and I was wondering if you could tell our listeners about those, and then I have a follow-up question.
Well, that question was asked, who in their right mind would want to do this, and 40% of the audience said, let's go. The 3 C's that you need are cash, courage, and creativity. Not necessarily in that order. And again, more seriously, a commitment to doing the right thing. Dedicated, good engineering, good construction, and dedicated post-closure care. Otherwise, they won't work.
Great. Thank you, Joe. And, thinking about our audience, we have a substantial number of state and local government representatives with us today. I'm thinking that, let's say that the local government has courage and creativity in great abundance, as well as a commitment to doing the right thing, but maybe cash is an issue. In that kind of case, what sorts of first steps could a local government take to still move ahead with at least exploring options for landfill redevelopment or the feasibility thereof?
Well, I'm sorry. Your question is what are the possible funding sources?
No, I'm thinking if the without getting into funding sources, because I think that's probably a deeper conversation. If there's a lack of cash but a willingness to investigate opportunities, what are some first steps that a local government can take? Do they start talking to regulatory agencies? Should they be marketing this site to developers? What have you seen that you think works?
Great question, and I'll use an example. I happen to be working on a project in an area that's being transferred from an old industrial area with a landfill to an intermodal transit hub that's served by rail and multi-office and other developments. The first steps they're taking are to do a site characterization to look at, all right, what are the challenges, the constraints to potential development? And they're looking at, in our case, a possible parking structure for a transit trains or others. What are the limitations? Can we take this material and move it away? So there are site investigations, feasibility studies that are being done, and then that information will be offered to the private sector as a developer interest, where they might want to put this land out and say, okay, it's all yours, here's your blank canvas, here we've characterized it, we've described it, here's what's in it, it's yours from here, within the context of whatever the planning or zoning regulations might be.
Great. Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that's we answer a lot of questions about funding here at CClear, and so I think that's a really great thing to hear, that you don't have to have the funding lined up to be able to start taking action to move these sites.
You just need to have a potential opportunity.
That's it. Yeah. A technical question for you. We talked about surcharge fill earlier, and you used the example of the parking lot in Southern California. You mentioned that it takes time for clean fill put over the top of an existing site to kind of work its way down and help even out some of the settlement. How much time does it take?
It could take months to years.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's more a function of your construction schedule. How much time do you have? And we've seen that landfills can settle anywhere from a few inches a year to as much as a foot a year, and that can hasten that and speed up that process.
Sure. Wow. And I want to encourage the audience. We have just a few minutes left, but if you have some burning questions, please do send them in. Looks like we have one more.
A question has come in, have you done anything on tribal lands? Our topic today is landfill redevelopment. I have to say, personally, I've not, although I am involved in permitting an active landfill on tribal lands, but not a redevelopment project. Mike, anything that you've done on tribal land?
Oh, I'm not sure I can talk about any of it. And I can think of one site that we looked at that was an industrial waste landfill on Indian tribal lands, but I really can't go into any details on that. I would like to maybe circle back on the earlier question about getting ready for these things. Sarah, I think that was your question.
Yep.
And the same kind of assessment steps that you often would do at other brownfield sites, perhaps alter just a little bit, would make sense to get the data together for a landfill site that you're trying to market. The key things are, what kind of waste is there? How old is it? How is it placed there? Trench fills, area fills, that kind of thing. How deep is it? And what's the nature of the water quality around it? And if you can start to put together a package that has some of that, that would be an excellent place to get started. That's normally where we get started when we come into a site, is trying to figure those kind of things out. And I can think of at least one site that was redeveloped with so-called TIF money, tax increment financing, and they were able to raise enough TIF money to offset completely the cost of the deep pile foundation and the methane mitigation system, so that what they were left with was essentially the same cost as to develop a shopping center on top of a greenfield.
Wow, that's a great example. Thank you so much, Mike.
I think we have one last question that is, I'll say, is non-technical, but it's a good one. It's how are the stigma issues addressed? All right, and I'm going to presume that means what people may have either real or perceived fears about a landfill, safety hazards and all the things we talked about, and they're certainly justified. How are those overcome? Well, we have seen on our projects that the key is being transparent as you move forward through the public hearing process, and that you anticipate all the things that could go wrong and that you address them as you move forward. For example, SCS Engineers was recently involved with a redevelopment of a landfill site in Southern California that's going to be a 2 million square foot office complex. The project team thought about everything from methane to settlement to capping to drainage to grading, and addressed them in advance to make sure that it was well understood that all the appropriate precautions, protections, and engineering controls were in place. Frankly, once you've transformed the land into something more attractive and remarkable, nobody knows. It's just the trained landfill people and the brownfields people like ourselves. I don't know, Mike, anything to add there on the stigma issues?
Oh, one small point. Around here we have natural occurring radon problems, and it turns out that the methane mitigation systems that we install on old landfills also handily take care of your radon. And once people understand, it can kind of get more comfortable with the concept of what these gas subslab systems are all about. That can go a long way toward easing the stigma. But I agree with you, Joe, that being open and honest about it and covering it direct head on is the preferred approach.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I can't think of a better question on which to wrap up what has been a really engaging hour. I want to give a huge thank you to Joe and to Mike and SCS Engineers for your support and for making this webinar possible. If you're listening, you will be receiving a recording of this webinar by email, so you can take Joe and Mike's wisdom with you. We will be presenting several more webinars, so you can see here our upcoming webinar schedule. Also encourage you to follow us on social media, go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, because that's how you can hear about all this good stuff. Next up, on August 2nd, will be the basics of site remediation, and that will bring together all 3 tab providers for a national webinar talking about Remediation 101. So be sure to join us. Like all the others, it's free and it'll be a good time. Do look for us at the Brownfields Conference. The National Brownfields Training Conference is coming up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, December 5th through 7th. CCLR will be there. We have a series of panels, of workshops, and of extracurricular activities. And so stay tuned for more. Finally, saddle up, because we're hosting a redevelopment rodeo at the National Brownfields Conference, and we are looking for your case studies. We want examples of projects from rural and urban communities that are facing a few challenges and could use some advice from a couple of redevelopment experts. So propose a site at our website or contact us for more information. This promises to be a good show with lots of good information. So send us your sites and your questions. I just want to offer our thanks one more time to Joe and to Mike and SCS Engineers. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful hour of landfill remediation education, or landfill remediation and redevelopment education. I think we've learned a lot about trends and about the possibilities. And if you have other questions, you'll be receiving you can download the slides, and feel free to reach out to Joe and to Mike or to the team here at CCLR. Thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you on August 2nd for Remediation 101. Have a good afternoon.